Morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for being here this morning. My name is Ivan Montes, and I am currently the proud principal of San Antonio Elementary School here in San Jose in the Elm Rock School District. So formerly, I worked at the district office. I was the district coordinator for English Learner Programs and Services for the last 3 years. Welcome the opportunity to be at a school site and be around students. I love that very much. Today we're going to have a conversation about English learners with disabilities, contextualizing language, and disability ideology and policy. So what does that all mean? Essentially, what I invite you all to do today is to bring your experiences into this room. I feel like we are our best asset. We have vantage points into our educational organizations and spaces. And so it's really important for us to share with each other how we experience or see the educational realities of our students unfolding. But today we're going to talk about how we can begin to reflect on or think about those experiences in a historical context or a shared historical context. So there are two intended objectives, and please hold me accountable to them. The first one is to reflect on the impact of the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. So it's a pretty vast document, and it's taken a lot of resources in putting it together. But we'll look at what I think are two very key components of that document. And then we'll begin to critically examine the historical legacies of the concepts and policies related to students identified as English learners and students identified as disabled. And I like to use the word identified or identified largely because it names the institutional process of putting students in categories. I don't know, I would say from my experience when I'm working with students, one of the challenges that I faced as an educator is having a conversation about disability with a student. And so I feel like naming, saying identified or categorized, really allows us to think systematically or organizationally. What are those institutional processes that are categorizing or labeling these students? Our essential question, something that I invite you to reflect on or ponder as we engage in our shared learning today, is how the English learner and disabled categories, how have they become normalized within our educational vernacular? So we use these terms, they're part of our everyday lived experience in education, but how do these terms come about? And why do we continue to use these terms? And what do they mean to us? So this is a brief outline of what we'll do today. So we're kind of just going through the first part of going over objectives. Then we'll have an opportunity for us to share what these terminologies or these terms really mean for us and how do we make meaning of them within our own context. And then we'll talk about, well, what is success for students identified as English learners, for students identified as having disabilities? How do we understand that? And then we'll have a conversation about, well, if there's this practitioner guide that was put forward, what is the problem that this practitioner guide is looking to kind of address? What is really driving this, the creation of this document? And then have a shared conversation about what are current policy solutions, and then thinking about demystifying the English learner and disabled categories within a historical context. So thank you for your support in putting this timeline together for you all. So I'll be the first to say that the way in which we organized historical events is a political act. And so by no means is this one, it is just one snapshot of how I've made meaning of our historical educational reality. But I invite you to reflect on these events in history as a launching point into our shared reflection. So to start us off, I left these larger Post-it notes on the aisle seat. And so anyone who's on the aisle seat, we had these larger Post-it notes. Every person will need 3 Post-it notes. And I remember you from last year. Were you here last year? Oh, no?
Not me.
Oh, sorry. Okay. 3 Post-it notes. Three Post-it notes. So on the first one, it'll be for long-term English learners. The second one will be for disability. And the third one will be for English learner. And on this Post-it note, I invite you to just jot down how you understand these terms. So for example, I'll think about long-term English learner. That term might mean something to me, so I'm just inviting you to write down what it means to you. There's no wrong answer. We don't need to look it up. We don't need to search for the policy definition of it. It's just, what do these terms mean to us? So I invite you to one, just label them on your Post-it note, and then write, what do these terms communicate to you, or what meaning do these terms have for you? Does anyone need extra Post-it notes? Yes. We have more. Who needs more?
Sure, I'll look for one right now.
It looks like there's one right here.
There we go. I think we're good. We're good?
Thank you. Just by a show of fingers, how many more minutes would you need? Okay, we'll take one more minute. Those of you that are already finished, what I invite you to do is just place your Post-it notes in the corresponding area. So for your English learner Post-it, I invite you to just post it on the wall next to the sign here, long-term English learner next to the back wall, and disability right up here in the front. Okay. So, um, just as a general practice, in my work, working with my peers, I found it important to really take a moment to engage in shared meaning making around the terms that we were using. And what I came to find for myself is I had an assumption of what we all meant when I was using certain terms and when other people were using certain terms. And I would say that these terms are also influenced by my own educational experience of how I experienced education in the United States and the experience of family members who perhaps fell into some of these categories. And all of those are impacting the way that I make meaning of all of these terms. So I think it's important for us to just see how we as a collective now in this room understand these terms. And later on, when we engage in a gallery walk of the timeline, I invite you to also read how we in this room are making meaning of these terms today. So I ask a lot of questions throughout our time today. And this is also meant for us to have a conversation with each other. So there are two questions that I really pose to, in general. What is success for students identified as English learners? And what is success for students identified as having disabilities? And so what I invite you to do now is we'll tackle the first one. So what is success for students identified as English learners? And what I would like for you all to do, if you can just turn to the person sitting next to you and just share your initial thoughts of how do you understand success? Or turn around the person behind you, or a trio for students identified as English learners. What is our general shared understanding of success for students identified as English learners? If you could hear my voice, clap once. If you can hear my voice, clap twice. Okay. I apologize if you were in the middle of discussing. What were some things that surfaced for you, or just highlights? Was there connections? What did you all land on in your discussion of success for English learners?
We felt that any progress can really be defined as success rather than putting an arbitrary metric on it.
Mm-hmm.
Just seeing the continuous improvement for both of the categories listed.
Okay, and when you for the English learner one, how do you understand progress? Is it language acquisition? Okay, thank you. So any sort of growth in language acquisition. And someone on this side? Yes.
Well, so we were also talking about success as being maintaining the primary language and adding English to that, or adding another language, right, so that it's not subtractive of the first language.
So maintaining what students, what assets they're already, what they already have, and so it's not kind of devaluing that, you're saying, in adding to. Great. Yes.
We also talked about just having access to the content, no matter where they are in acquiring a second language, because, just supporting them where they are, because I work with the little ones, so we want to make sure that they have access all along the way, and they're included in every part of that classroom.
So success, as you understand it, is inclusion in the classroom space to the general curriculum.
Right.
Yes.
My colleague and I were discussing that. Does it have to be limited to success for this by the category that they're defined as? Why not just success for students? And what are the overarching goals that we want them to be leading our public school systems in high school? As a parent, if you're thinking about this, even middle school and high school teacher, do they have the skills to communicate the ideas? Can they collaborate well with each other? Are they thinking critically about it? They should all have that opportunity to learn those skills.
Sure. So you're saying really questioning the categorization. So what is the utility of this categorization? And aren't these things in general, when we talk about success, are these things that we want for all of our students, not just within students within these categories?
Right, so it's almost as if we need to keep our focus on anchoring on these big goals first, the overarching goals for our students, and then the ramps to get them there based on the supports that we need to provide for them.
Great. So as you can see, even within this room, we as a collective understand success to be perhaps aligned, but the nuances are different. How does policy, or when we look at the CDE in California, what are the goals that they're looking to actualize for students identified as English learners? And they clearly spell out two, right? Ensure that English learners acquire full proficiency in English as rapidly and effectively as possible, and attain parity with native speakers of English. That's goal number one. Goal number two is ensure that English learners, within a reasonable period of time, achieve the same rigorous grade level academic standards that are expected of all students. That is goal number two. So within all of the policy and all of the initiatives, they're looking to actualize processes that will create those to be a reality. And I would say that having worked at the district office, one of the main questions that I would ask our partners in this work as community, whether it's an instructional program provider, whether it's a service provider, is what is the problem that they're looking to address? Like, what are they actually trying to achieve? How do you understand this problem to provide your service? And how do you understand success? Because I found that to provide me a lot of clarity in making meaning of how are they positioning students within their instructional program or approaches? Like, how do they see the students that they're looking to serve? And then secondly, what to them would be, if all things worked out well, this is the pie in the sky, what the vision for society that they're looking to establish. So those are really two questions that I really kept at the forefront for myself whenever I entered spaces with instructional program providers, engaging with my peers, and that really helped me to see, okay, this is the vantage point in which they're really ingrained in. So it really helped me out a lot. When we look at, did you all have an opportunity to talk about disability yet? Okay, so what I invite you all to do now is to get back into or connect back with your peers and discuss what is success for students identified as having disabilities. What is success for them? If you could hear my voice, clap once. If you can hear my voice, clap twice. Okay. So we had an opportunity to hear from our peers. What surfaced in those conversations? What are for you?
We
Okay.
Here we go.
So I'd say success would be having students learn to be as independent and functional as possible and be able to like go out into the world and be independent and contribute to society and feel successful.
Great. So working with them to develop independence, to be functional within our society.
Have so they have worth and meaning. And
I was talking about this morning that group from the high school that was so eloquent, that the so-called typical developing peers just fully embracing the students with disabilities, and then it was just part of that whole school culture. It was, a priority for that school and from the administrator down, but just that everybody embraced that full inclusion met in every aspect of that school, not just recess and the cafeteria.
So within a school site or a school ecosystem, students that perhaps fall into this category are fully included within the everyday experiences,
Yes.
similar to everyone else.
Yes. And that they're accepted by everyone.
So what does our current policy tell us about what success is, right? So I've just highlighted 3, right? So we have IDEA, and they, within that document, what's stated is to prepare students for further education, employment, and independent living, and then this is my sort of interpretation, economic self-sufficiency, to fully participate in or contribute productively to society. So that is how this policy understands success for students. When we look at Raleigh, which was a court case that was institutionalized before Andrew F., it was special education services to students is not a guarantee to a particular outcome or maximize potential, but rather to only ensure some educational benefit. So that was how success was understood within Raleigh. And now where we're at with Andrew F. is IEPs must be specially designed to meet the child's unique needs, and it must provide a level of instruction that is reasonably calculated to provide advancement through the regular curriculum. And this is the Supreme Court case that is more recent. And so you can see, even within our guiding policy, how the understandings of success differed, right? From the minimalist understanding of Raleigh to perhaps a more defined understanding of success under Andrew F. And I share those for us to sort of ponder and think about, well, when we look in isolation, and I would say in my experience of education, and my entry point into this conversation is I was a student who was identified as an English learner for a portion of my educational experience. I am the uncle of a student who was in SDC services for 5 years, who was really involved in that process, which was super eye-opening to me, and it really changed the way that I functioned within my role at the district office. I would say that I was an educator, but when I went into the IEP meetings as on the other side, it was nerve-wracking. It's so, at least my experience was, it was really enlightening. And I would say that that experience has helped shape how I make meaning of all of this today. But I share that for us to think about. Well, we talked about how these understandings of success in isolation, when we look at the English learner category and the students with quote-unquote disabilities category, there are policies that are defining success in those realms. How are those notions of success coming together currently? and what is the problem that we're trying to solve. So everyone should have a copy of, and this is literally the beginning. It's a two-pager, so it's super short. It looks like this. It says the introduction. And for those of you that are joining us virtually, it's one of the documents that are uploaded. So it's just a front and back. What I invite you to do is to really go to analyze this document or go through it and ask yourself, what is the problem that this document, how is this document understanding the problem for the students within this intersection? So what is the problem? If you've finished reading through it, I invite you to connect back with someone sitting next to you and share what surfaced for you in the document and seek to understand what surfaced for them in the document with regards to what the problem might be. If you could hear my voice, clap once. If you can hear my voice, clap twice. Okay. In kind of just listening in, I heard a few things. I'm just going to name out one from here. So you pose the question, what are the problems? Not so much the problem. Can you share more?
Yeah, so we were talking about. Just a sec. Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. This is good. This is a UDL practice. So on in the third paragraph at the bottom, it says this. The purpose of this was developed to provide information on identifying, assessing, supporting, and reclassifying English learners who may qualify for special education services and pupils with disabilities who may be classified as English learners. And so within that, there are many layers of problems that this guidebook is setting out to address. The first may be identifying. Right? How do you actually identify those students who are both? But if there's an over-identification happening, which is later laid out here, then that's only one of many problems around how do you really serve the students that are in your school in the ways that they need. Also, I think Liz.
Anyone else? What did you all land on within your conversations about what might be the root of what is being discussed or driving this document? Yes, in the back.
Well, with students that are English learners, I think that in special education, special educators often have good intentions, but they don't see what those good intentions actually do to students. When you label a student that's an English learner as having a disability, as a 14, 15, 16-year-old, you're really damaging that child socially in terms of how they view themselves and their self-esteem. So we have a problem, number one, with looking at how students acquire language and looking at language acquisition as a deficit rather than an asset. That's number one. And also that in the assessment process, there's the exclusionary factors as far as specific learning disability, and those are not being carefully looked at, which leads to the over-identification. The exclusionary factors are those like second language acquisition, vision and hearing, poor school attendance, those.
Thank you. So what you're sharing is, or you're really inviting us to think about is, when we position students within these categories, what impact does that have on the student, be it socially, be it internally for that student, and how does that factor into it?
Yeah, and I think the way to think about it is that when a child is in high school and they are labeled as having a disability, we're not saying that the school system has failed them. We're not saying that they are in poverty and maybe that's partly a contributor, or that they've come from a different country and that's, like at 6th, 7th grade, and that's also a contributor. We're saying you have a disability. There is something within your brain that is wrong as far as having a learning disability. I'm not sure what the data are, but I'm sure those 24% at the high school level, the majority of them are probably SLD.
Great. Thank you for your comment. So really thinking about what is the cause? Is it internal, something that the student brings, or is it more environmental, that perhaps the student engaging with the environment is a factor to how he landed within that classification? These are all very important questions, and I invited you all to discuss this question in terms of problem, because I believe that how we understand policy, how we understand success, a lot of the terminology that we use is part of a larger legacy of beliefs. And so what I'm going to invite you all to do now is, within the next 28 minutes, to engage in a timeline walk. I'll be transparent to say that the majority of items within this timeline relate to the notion of disability, or the notion of second language, or another that is within the educational setting that is learning a language. And they're in chronological order. It doesn't really, the starting point, it starts right here, but it doesn't necessarily, your walk into the timeline doesn't have to start right here. So what we'll do is, and I really invite you to take time to think through and process it. There are Post-it notes, again, at the aisle of each table. And what I invite you all to do is to use these Post-it notes, one, for us to just see as a team where we're at with the timeline. So we have these greenish blue Post-its. And if you come to a moment in the timeline that is surprising or new learning for you, I invite you to just use one of these and put it on there. If you come to a moment in the timeline where, with the following, what possible impact the event had to dominant group. So dominant, when I refer to dominant, I mean white English-speaking Americans, so people who are a dominant portion of our society. And then when I think of subordinates, I would say minoritized individuals within our educational setting. be it language, be it ability, so on and so forth. So for those, I invite you to put a pink Post-it note. And it's just a way for us to just see where are we at in the entrance of this timeline. So with that, first off, I invite you all to make sure you secure they're little Post-it notes. I have extras, so you'll need a few of each color. You have yours, right?
You guys must know each other. You both think you know each other. I don't know what it is.
Okay, and feel free to open up those Post-it notes and make them smaller. So you'll need a few of each color. So you got some? Here you go.
Are these going to be up on?
They are. So these are uploaded to the website. So they are yours. It did take me a long time. Yeah.
Where do we start?
Sure. Okay. So does everyone have their thumbs if you have your Post-it notes? Okay. Or raise your hand if you still need Post-it notes. Perfect. So we are going to go for 12 o'clock is our stopping point. So really take time to digest this timeline in. And we'll go. So I invite you to timeline walk. So it looks like some folks are, if you're still on the timeline, feel free to finish up. Those of you that have already finished, what I invite you to do now is to engage in a shared discussion, perhaps with the same person you've been collaborating or a new person, around 3 questions. What did you notice across the timeline, themes, trends? In what ways have some of these events impacted you? And in what ways are these events impacting our students? And so I invite you to engage in a shared discussion around those 3 questions. If you could hear my voice, clap once. If you can hear my voice, clap twice. So in walking around or listening in, I've heard some rich reflection, and I firmly believe that part of our shared learning or commitment to each other in a space is to share our thinking with each other. So what I'll do is I invite you all to perhaps share a thought or reflection with a colleague or a peer within the room. Based on these questions, based on what you noticed, themes, impacts, things that impacted you.
So we noticed something interesting. One of them was that usually advancements and progress in the provision of services to students with special needs follows or kind of is 1 or 2 steps behind civil rights improvement. So as our civil rights right now are coming under challenge, and I think there'll be even more challenge in the future, what is going to be the effect on special education, and what's going to happen? The other thing that we noticed was that we're running out of money, and usually budgets determine services. Intention is great, knowledge is great, research is fantastic, but who cares about that? We have a bilingual education, for example. Talk about FAPE. What is the best education for a bilingual student? A student that you and I come into this country not speaking English. Give us bilingual education, and we'll learn. We can then become administrators if we want to. Yet California went through it and said, no, it costs too much money. They should learn English anyway, and they got rid of it. Now they're coming back and saying, oops, sorry, now we have LTEL 7th graders who never redesignated. Bring it back. So they brought it back with minimal funding. We have the case of runaway $1 million special ed parents and families, all right? We can't sustain that. So because a couple of them were talking abuse the system, we could very much get a newspaper rolled up and smacked on the nose and said, get rid of all special education or bring it back to per student capita expenditures. So all that to say, stand by, see what happens.
Thank you. Great. So you're making connections to our current lived reality within the greater state narrative of change and drawing a trend in terms of perhaps changes in civil rights practices and what the timeline has been to students within the category of disability and where that is within that timeline. Great. Thoughts, reflections?
So as we look at inclusion and UDL practices, I think it puts pressure on general ed to actually service the needs of all students in classrooms. And that doesn't mean that individuals don't get special services, but I think the pressure is there. I think we're in an interesting time because it runs smack against institutional racism at this point, I think, and I just think the next 10 years is going to be pretty dramatic. We can't have general ed classrooms, I'm going to say as a whole, function as they have been and still service the needs of all students. Nope. You're not going to talk.
Well, I know that there's a lot that was shared, and so I just want to go back. I'll share kind of how I make meaning of all of this and kind of where I'm at. And I go back to these moments in history. 1848. So 1848 was when there was the Mexican secession of territory to the United States. 2 years later, there's the establishment of the state of California. 2 years later. And so what does that mean in terms of policy, beliefs, what is success, how we as a society should function, what are our social norms, and how is that changing within 2 years? Fast forward 171 years later, this is where we're at. And so what I wonder is, how does our larger narrative in terms of what is normal, what are we working to accomplish, is being understood within this reality, right? Those are the different counties. So we went from the secession to 1850, and some would argue that it was a colonization of land, right? Manifest destiny, a westward expansion. But it's not just a physical establishment, it's also ideational, right? You people are bringing beliefs and ideas to territories, and they're institutionalizing them within practices based on what they believe, or codified policies like you saw throughout the timeline. And so my question to you all is, reflecting on that, what is our role within this historical trajectory? I would say that I've been complicit in this history and in these practices, but I also feel like how we go about the work really matters. How we go about serving the students who are positioned as language and minoritized, as having, being identified with disabilities, how we go about doing that work matters within this. I feel like we have agency within that. I wouldn't be a school principal if I didn't think that. And so the question that I pose to you all is how might we move forward? And I feel like when and for me, this was largely part of my dissertation work when I was at Penn, engaging in this research. And it's very easy to just read it and then continue to function in the organization and do what we do. But then knowing or reflecting on these realities, how do we move forward in a meaningful way to better serve students? And so my invitation to you all is, what action can you take tomorrow moving forward to think or share or perhaps what action can you take moving forward for students within this intersection, given the historical context that we just discussed and reflected on? So that's what I got. I'm more than happy to answer questions that you have. I want to be, I'm more than happy to answer questions. Yeah.
So I know that in the research that you did, you did some interviewing with students, and you had some feedback from students about the labeling. Could you share a little bit with that with the group?
Yeah, so part of my work was to work with students. So I looked at students who were, have only been in school within the district that I worked at, from kinder, who were within 7th or 8th grade. They were within the intersection of both of these classifications. And I wanted to know how they negotiated these policies that we as an educational system were imposing on them. And what I noticed is students, what I've seen is, one, they refuse to take the LPAC. That's one reality, right? They'll say this test isn't for me. And then so they're standing their ground and saying, I'm not going to take it. I speak English. Why do I have to take this exam? I've been taking it since I was in kindergarten, and I speak English. I don't speak another language. This is what students are saying. So they refuse to take it. But in their negotiation of that reality, what happens is they're perpetuating the cycle, because they're going to stay within that category because state policy requires that they now get a 4 overall within that. Other students will, even today, they'll talk about realities where they're redirected in class to not use a language that's not English within their classroom setting. And this is today. And so they resist that as well by not going to class, choosing to opt out of those spaces, or choosing to continue to use the language, what one student called the language of power, and the language that they speak at home.
So we talk about person first language for students with disabilities, and I'm wondering why the label of English learner persists in the research and throughout our schools, and why people are referred to as English learners instead of students who are learning English. I don't get it. It just doesn't seem like we should have that label. What do you think?
What do I think? Yeah. So I feel like there is a larger utility of the term from policy that's hoping to name a problem that has been understood within our society, right? Does everyone fit that category perfectly? I don't think so. I would say, in my experience, students come from, yeah, there's another language spoken at home. That doesn't necessarily mean that they speak it. And they identify as being English dominant, but they're still within that category. And I would say something that was really eye-opening to me is the criteria to exit that category varies from the county or the district that you're in. And so I would say these are my beliefs. My beef mostly is with the LTEL label. I think that's super problematic, right? I think the long-term English learner label, when you see how people describe long-term English learners, it's hugely negative. They lack language. They're not successful in school. And so how are we understanding students within that category? And yeah, I think it's the result of a failure of policy. I feel like the policy there was not adequately serving all students. I might not be answering your question, but yes.
Sorry. I noticed in your biography and the thing that you've been in other countries, and so I just had a wondering that just popped in my head. Do other countries have Finnish language learner policies and Korea? I don't even know in Korea. Do they have education? They're saying that kids have to be obtaining the dominant language of the country in order to be successful students. Do other countries have that, or is it just Americans?
I feel like I might not be the best person to answer that question, but I would say that from my vantage point, I think that this phenomenon doesn't just happen with English. I would say that there's a larger debate of questioning the whole notion of a standard language, and so there are some linguists who would say that no, the Spanish that people speak or the English that people speak is valid, and question the whole notion of their language use being deficient. And so I would say that from what I noticed, that phenomena occurs in other languages as well. And with that, I want to thank you. I want to make sure I get back for yard duty. And so thank you all, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference.